I remember you telling some stories about how people coming and telling you how you helped them find their way to Jesus and find their way to the Lord just to find out you're a Karaite.
Yeah. Well, I've definitely had. Well, look, I did a podcast about this. You know, I've got my podcast, Hebrew Voice.
Yeah.
People could look it up on the
Great podcast, by the way.
Thank you. And I interviewed a friend of mine who had come to me during a time of crisis. I interviewed him years later about this, and he was going through I'm trying to remember the exact thing. People couldn't find it on the podcast, but basically he was going through a crisis of faith, and he asked me a question, something to the effect of, "Okay, I know you don't believe in Jesus. You're Jewish. You're not a Christian. You're not a Messianic Jew. But what would be the best argument in favor of belief in Jesus?" And my background is academia. Actually, my background before that is studying the Talmud. My father was an Orthodox rabbi. And the way they study things in the Talmud is you can ask any question and analyze it from different perspectives. And it's not always what the answer is. It's sometimes more important what the question is and how you ask it. And there's pros and cons for every argument. So I'm like, all right, as an intellectual exercise, I can say if I wanted to argue in favor of Jesus, and if I was a believer, here's how I would argue, right? And look, there's something called confirmation bias, right? Confirmation bias is when somebody already kind of believes something, and then they cherry pick evidence to support that. And people who are believers, I'm a believer in Judaism, you're a believer in Christianity, I suppose. I don't know you that well. The non-believers will say, okay, you guys just believe that because you have confirmation bias. Well, maybe, but the non-believer is confirmation bias too, right? When they find something that doesn't fit logically, they'll say, okay, well, there's an infinite number of universes, right? Well, why'd they come up with the multiverse theory? Because, and there's a whole bunch of reasons, right, that I don't know enough to get into, and what I do know, I don't have time to get into. But basically, they said there's a bunch of things in physics that don't make sense. And the only way to explain this is to say there's an infinite number of universes, and we just happen to be in the universe where it does make that sense, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's actually kind of a convoluted explanation. It might be correct or not, but they know that, or I should say they're looking for a naturalistic explanation. And if you have to have a naturalistic explanation, you might have to posit the existence of an infinite number of universes, right? Mm-hmm. So the point is, do we as believers do that in our own faiths? Perhaps in a way we do. Does that make any sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So let's put it this way. So there's this famous, I'll bring this Talmudic story, and I'm not a Talmudic Jew, I'm what's called a Karaite Jew, which means I'm strictly a believer in the Old Testament.
And I was going there. I was going to ask you about that, but I'll let you tell your story first.
Well, but I was raised as an Orthodox Jew. My father was a rabbi, like I said, also a lawyer. Mm-hmm. So he knew how to argue things from different perspectives, right? Mm-hmm. That was what a lawyer needs to do. That's what a rabbi needs to do. Is, okay, there's truth. I don't know what that truth is, but I can try to approach the truth by asking different questions and making different arguments. And maybe it's a good argument, maybe it's not, maybe it's convincing, maybe it's not. But what are all the possibilities, right? It's something that I think a lot of the young people are afraid of. They've been sheltered, and then they hear an opposing view for the first time, and they're horrified. They need like puppies and crayons because they've never heard somebody who has a different view from them. They live in these little bubbles. Well, that's completely contrary to my upbringing. Look, where I grew up in Chicago, and I remember when the Nazis marched in Skokie, and they wanted to march in Skokie, actually, and there was a lawsuit. And at the time, it was considered this wonderful thing that the Nazis were being represented by a Jew. And my father was a lawyer, so I'm like, okay, what's going on here? Why would some Jew represent the Nazis in court? And the explanation my father gave me, and I think that was common at the time, was we're fighting for their freedom of speech, not because we care about them. It's because if they take away their freedom of speech, our freedom of speech will be taken away. And the irony is that having this very conversation is probably going to get this podcast shadow banned. That's the irony of it, right?
Hey, I don't mind.
So
but I'm going to tell you right now, Nehemia, I was gonna go there anyways.
Okay.
I was already planning on having this conversation with you.
So I want to talk about, you know, the confirmation bias, right?
Mhm.
So there's this wonderful discussion in the Talmud about King David, and some of the rabbis are trying to explain away all the bad things that David did, and they'll say, you know, he didn't actually commit adultery with Bathsheba, and the reason he didn't come out, and they have a convoluted explanation. I don't even need to go into it, right? They'll say, well, technically she was divorced, and it's not what it says in the Bible, but they'll come up with these convoluted explanations. And there's a response to that in the Talmud, which is really beautiful. And it's another rabbi comes along and he says, you came up with these convoluted explanations because you're a descendant of King David. And so you're just trying to justify your ancestor to make yourself look better, right? There's this whole obsession with lineage that they talk about in the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
And look, that goes on in Judaism for sure.
If it didn't, you wouldn't know you were Jesus' cousin.
Right. But at the same time, I don't know the name of the farmer who spent his days, hunched over on his back, harvesting wheat, right? Because that guy's name wasn't recorded, right? So the point was that they're accusing these other rabbis, you're just justifying your ancestor because you're descended from King David. And what's really interesting is this debate from around 1800 years ago from these different rabbis, one descendant of King David and the other not, was repeated in the Knesset, in Israel's parliament in the 1990s, where one of the secular members of Knesset called King David a bully and a womanizer, which, okay, fair enough, right? But one of the things that's interesting about Jewish history is the Bible and Jewish history in general. We expose all of our flaws, right? We don't pretend that King David was a perfect person because, as Solomon said when he dedicated the temple, there is no man who does not sin, right? It's part of our human condition, right? So in the Knesset, they made, they said, oh, David was just, why are we idolizing him? He was a bully and a womanizer. Okay. But he also repented, right? So he had his flaws and he was imperfect and he did his best. And no one's perfect, right? There's this kind of like postmodernist idea, I think it is, where you want to take whoever the hero is of the past, and they call it in Hebrew shattering myths, right? And you want to find everything that's wrong with that person. Well, show me somebody who's not perfect, and you could maybe point to Jesus. I don't know, but show me someone who's human and only human, who's not perfect, who is perfect. There is nobody like that, right? So everybody has their flaws, is the point. And so when this friend of mine asked me, okay, what would it, if you were a Christian, and what would be the best argument to, in defense of believing in Jesus, I'm able to answer him. I'm not threatened by that question, right? And he later said that he was on his way out of believing in Jesus, and that allowed him to believe again.
But so on the flip side, if it was, why believe in Satan, you would have told him the same thing, or not the same thing, but
that's a good question. I love that question. You know what I love about that question is it shows you have the intellectual openness to say, and I've had this conversation with some Christians and they cannot hear it. In the same vein that I can say why believe in Jesus if I was a believer, I could say why believe in Satan if I was. I actually don't know what the answer to that is. Why believe in Satan, right?
Yeah.
But in theory, I could have that conversation. I could also,
if someone asked you could argue their point.
Right. I could also tell you the reasons not to believe in Satan. I could probably come up with reasons to believe in Mohammed or not believe in Mohammed. I certainly could come up with reasons not to believe in Mohammed. I don't know exactly off the top of my head what the reasons to believe in Mohammed would be, because that's not my field of expertise. But yeah, it's an intellectual exercise, which is really important. And I think this is a very Jewish approach, what I'm saying here. And you could say it's not biblical if you want. I don't know. We could have that conversation. But it's certainly part of the Jewish culture as it evolved over the centuries, which is, like I said, to ask questions. I've been told by Christians that if they even questioned certain doctrines in their heart, they were afraid they were going to go to hell.
Well, I personally think that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to question the world, and even if even if you believe all completely one way, you should know the other perspective. You should know the flip side of the coin and everything they're going to argue.
Absolutely right. Well, that's how people get surprised, is they don't know what the other arguments is going to be. That's how people end up losing their faith in Christianity. I'm not saying always, but I've seen it happens where they've never heard the other argument, and they're presented with the most simple argument from the Jewish side or from the Muslim side, and they end up converting to Islam or leaving Christianity because they've just never heard the other argument. So the Jewish approach is to say, you don't really believe unless you've questioned, right? And you don't have to agree with this, but this is the Jewish attitude to say, like, let's say about believing in God. If you've never questioned that God exists, whether he exists or not, then you don't really believe in God. You're just repeating what somebody told you, right? That's the Jewish approach, right? And you don't have to accept that or agree with that. Well, but I believe there's a lot of value in that.
Not an offense, but have you ever heard? I know you've heard that the joke of what happens when you get two Jews in a room.
Yeah, you get three opinions. You get three opinions.
Yeah, 3 opinions. Right. Which
and my joke is when you get two Karaites in a room, you get 5 opinions. So,
hey, that's a great thing. That's a great thing. Yeah. You should be able to explore everything. The guys that I told you to if you might be able to get on their podcast, that's the reason they started their podcast. They actually wrote up a list of things that couldn't be talked about in church, and sat there and talked about them.
Yeah. Look, and I understand that people have emotional commitments to certain ideas, and so if I'm trying to think of I'm trying to play the Nehemia's advocate here, right? In other words, if you came to me and said, okay, you say you're open about everything, let's talk about Holocaust denial and why you don't believe it. All right, kind of don't waste my time. I've met people who survived the Holocaust. Yeah. I've been to the death camps, right? So look at, and I think in American discourse, they call this the Overton window, right? So the Overton window are the things that are legitimate to discuss. But I think anything's legitimate to discuss, right? There was this Holocaust denier named David something or another. And he sued this Holocaust researcher named Deborah Lipstadt, and he sued her in British court because she called him she basically said like this, something which I don't think scholars generally will say. She'll say, David Irving, that was his name. So David Irving was a famous historian of World War II, like a serious historian. And then he started to deny the Holocaust. And Deborah Lipstadt, who was a Jewish researcher of the Holocaust, she said, David Irving's too good of an historian to deny the Holocaust unless he's being intellectually dishonest. I hope I'm getting this right. Not, please don't sue me. So she was saying he knows he's misrepresenting the, this is my understanding of at least. She accused him of deliberately misrepresenting the sources. She said he's too good of an historian. It couldn't be by accident. He knows he's mistranslating the German texts and all that, whatever. I don't know the exact, I don't remember the exact details. This ended up in a court case. And I think it was a really important court case because Deborah Lipstadt had to prove certain elements of the Holocaust in court, and she won. And I'll be honest, I read some but here's the thing. Here's my point of bringing up the Deborah Lipstadt, David Irving case. So I actually read some of the descriptions and transcripts, I guess. They brought out a lot of the evidence, and you can find it online. And I'm like, how come I've never heard of this? I've been to Auschwitz, I've been to Majdanek, I've been to Treblinka, and nobody ever told me about these elements of the evidence, right? So I believe in the Holocaust because I've met Holocaust survivors, and I don't believe they're lying to me. I've met, and I've been to those places, and I've seen some of the things I've seen. I've seen bones in the ovens at Majdanek. All right. If 100 years from now, 200 years from now, no one's going to be able to say I met a Holocaust survivor. So bringing this into the public record was really important, right? Imagine if somebody came along 200 years later and they start to have the kind of conversations I'm hearing the postmodernists have today about the Holocaust, right? That's all Holocaust denial is. It's postmodernism applied to the Holocaust. It's really what it is. Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism, and so is anti-Zionism, to me. It's very clear to me. Both of those are forms of postmodernism. So I think these are important questions to have. Here's my point of all this, and I'll let you ask your question, which is I've talked to Christians, and they'll say, okay, here's the reasons we believe in Jesus. And I'll ask what to me is a really basic question. Okay, have you taken that same thought pattern for proving Jesus and applied it to other figures in history? And they get deeply offended. How dare you compare belief in Jesus to belief in, whoever, just name it, right? Mm-hmm. It's not that it's an intellectual exercise that I think is very useful and important. And you might be asked 2 or 3 questions by an atheist or a Jew or a Muslim. And if you've never thought about these things, you're going to get blindsided.